Helen Mcgeough, Analyst Lead on Plastics Recycling for ICIS, presenting Circular Plastics, the changing shape of the industry.
Hello, everybody. Very nice to see you all, if not be with you all. And I'm very thankful for Suffolk inviting me to join you today. I'm Helen Mcgeough, one of the senior analysts looking at plastics recycling here at ICIS. Very quickly, if you don't know who ICIS is, that stands for Independent Commodity Intelligence Services. So basically, we do data and analytics around commodity markets, and hence why I'm here today. I'm focused very much on plastics recycling. I've been looking at this market for about 18 years, so hopefully I can share some insights from that knowledge. My title is Circular Plastics, the Changing Shape of the Industry. I sit in Europe, I sit in the UK, but I do have a very global perspective on things. But clearly, sitting in Europe, you can imagine we are a highly regulated region. So my opening slide may be no surprise to say, as I come to it, when we looking at what are the drivers to circularity, how is this, what is the landscape today for recycled plastics, and how do we look to advance this circularity? So as I say, sitting in Europe, highly regulated market, what's one of the key drivers to actually us all recycling our plastics? And that's legislation. It doesn't really matter where you sit in the world. I think it's fair to say that things are very much developing and changing on a regulatory front. In Europe, you can say we're more advanced or more mature in that sense. Clearly, we have a circular economy package driving our regulation and shaping our policy and directives. I'm putting up here one of the latest pieces of regulation that's come through in Europe on the packaging and packaging waste regulation. This came in November and is set to become law this year. And the reason I'm using it is to really illustrate the pace of change that there is going on in terms of regulation being that driver. We had the single-use plastics directive that came in a couple of years ago, or maybe a bit more now, losing track of time. But certainly we saw the impact of that in that, this bloomed across the world in terms of its adoption in different shapes and forms. But, there are lots of single-use plastic related regulations or bans now in place across the globe. And this piece of regulation, I think it's illustrative of the tone that there is out there in terms of, taking charge of what's happening with our waste. Ultimately, governments have the responsibility for managing our waste, and plastics waste is one of those. There's a lot of focus on, making sure, as our previous presenters just illustrated, moving through that hierarchy away from the landfill and incineration options that are less desirable, and ultimately getting to the more circular model, so using recycling as one of those methods. And what we can see is that, regulation is really shaping that. The ambition in Europe now has been extended quite extensively, where the single-use plastics directive was the first mandate of recycled content in Europe, and we've seen it happen in California, in other parts of the world. But what this does now, if you're looking at 2040, is you're looking at a recycled content of 65% in those single-use bottles. And it's pushing this much, much further forward. It's also introducing other models, things like the reuse and refill targets, something very new, a little bit contentious maybe, because the chain is having to figure out how they're going to achieve those targets. But one of the other indicators that came through is the seemingly recognition of chemical recycling counting towards targets. So there's a range of things here which we can see in parts in the rest of the world, but regulation is really shaping this. It's taking making very clear, how we recover for recycling, how that recycling actually happens, but also making sure that we make everything recyclable, which is one of the most important points and aspects, which is really driving the recycling market. And of course, what's one of the other key drivers? It's the end demand. Clearly, we see that illustrating the point through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's global commitment here. This is just a summation of the latest progress report. Clearly, the ambition was set by these signatories looking to increase the use of recycled content in their product and packaging in particular. And the ambition's not been small, but what we can see is that there are different levels of progress towards those targets, but still very much more to be done. But the ambition is there, and the line in the sand has been drawn, and these markets are very much focused on achieving these goals. So they're increasing the pressure and the expectations of the supply chain in order to deliver those recycled materials so they can start incorporating those into their products and their packaging. So this is a very important driver, because one of the important points to remember about these is that these are global commitments. And a lot of these brands, FMCGs, operate on a global basis, a multinational basis. So while they may be focused on hitting the targets that are coming up fastest in, say, Europe or some of the parts of the US, for instance, they're looking at this on a global scale. And it may not be today, but very shortly, they will start to look to achieve those same goals in different parts of the world. So it's a very important context. So we have regulation and end markets really driving this. And of course, we have to look at this in another context as well. What we have, according to our supply demand database, forecasting on some of the key polymers here, we have quite substantial growth coming in terms of the global market on the consumption of polymers. So, of course, that target, whether it be 25, 30%, is 25 or 30% of a very much growing market. So the adoption, the growth of that recycled supply has to grow in pace, essentially, with the growth in the consumption in order for those brands to and markets to actually achieve what they need to achieve in those targets. Because, of course, remembering those targets are voluntary from under the global commitment, and they sit on top of any regulation or mandates existing in the different individual markets. And, of course, the pledges being voluntary doesn't diminish that in any sense, because the reputational risk from these brands and from these companies is very important. So this is not a target that they want to miss. What we've done at ICIS is to actually look at the capacities for key polymers on a mechanical basis and a chemical basis. I'm going to talk through some of the information we have from mechanical at the moment. On a global basis, what you can see is quite a stark picture in terms of where we are with our virgin capacity and where we are with recycle today on the three key polymers of PET resins, PE and PP. And overall, what we see currently is that recyclable capacity as a share of global polymer capacity sits around 13%. So immediately you can see that there is an imbalance in the market in terms of where the market wants and needs to be in those recycled content levels, and the potential today. It doesn't match up at this point in time. There is an imbalance. But of course, Lots of projects are there, and lots of investment is happening. But at the moment, most markets are structurally short of recycled polymers. So, of course, what can we expect to see? Well, we're seeing lots of developments, and I quite like this as a visual to illustrate a couple of points. So on the, let me work it out, left-hand side is mechanical, right-hand side is chemical. And this is just a heat map of those capacities as they sit in the market today. And what we can see is that there is great regional disparity in terms of some regions are much more progressed than others in terms of installing those capacities for a variety of reasons, different levels of maturity, different infrastructures in place, different drivers from a regulatory point of view. But we also have quite a nascent industry from chemical recycling, in that the installations at the moment are still relatively low in comparison to mechanical. And again, much more regional disparity as well. But the point is these are opportunities as well. And it's not that some markets aren't doing anything or aren't aware, but they really do have to scale up and develop those capacities more substantially and at larger scales. What we're also seeing from a mechanical side is that, mechanical recycling, I think there is a tendency to think about the core established markets, but we're actually seeing a lot of innovation as well. Things like tray-to-tray recycling in the PET sector, in particular in Europe, and again, US markets are seeing this also, is really starting to develop and grow, gain some pace in terms of that technology developments, but also the capacities actually now being set up and running. It's come about from the fact that they've been under huge pressure, the sheet sector, the thermoform sector, from the bottle sector, and in terms of the competition for supply. But that competition has created this innovation, and we're seeing that result in new capacities. The same for flexible packaging. When you look at some of the regulation and how it's very much focused on the unnecessary packaging or the difficult to recycle, this is, leading the sectors and these industry sectors to try and find those solutions needed to actually improve the circularity. And flexibles is one of those, and we see a lot of new capacities rising up for that specifically. Of course, there are other polymers, PVC, PS. I guess they get a lot of bad press, I suppose, is a way to put it. As they don't have high recycling rates necessarily at the moment, but that's not to say that they're not able to. Technically, it's possible, and the activity happens, but again, it's getting to a scale that is really necessary. And some of these polymers fall very much under the single-use bracket as well, which of course gets a lot of focus. So we're having to see, again, solutions coming about. But this is why we're seeing movements like Styrenic Circular Solutions, always have to remember the acronym, coming on board with, getting its the industry itself together to actually come up with those solutions. Collection is one of the biggest challenges for polystyrene, but that's equally gaining momentum in terms of participation by the industry, supporting that and trying to bring forward those solutions to prove that as a polymer it offers a sustainable and circular solution. For chemical recycling, what we see at the moment, it's largely represented by pyrolysis and PET depolymerization, generally speaking, across the globe. The average plant capacity announced is very much growing, and is somewhat larger than the typical mechanical capacities. not necessarily substantially so for some regions, but we anticipate that that could continue to grow on average as plants are proven at scale and are able therefore to scale up. Excuse me, getting over a cold, I apologise. And one of the other positive developments globally is the regulatory status. So we're seeing much more, I mentioned indications from European legislation. We see, I think it's 20 odd states, individual states in the US now have a positive position on chemical recycling, recognizing it as recycling. So, things are changing that are going to help the adoption of chemical recycling as well as mechanical recycling. So plenty of options are being developed to deal with more of the plastics waste and finding solutions for those to make them more circular. Of course, touching upon chemical recycling, we don't have time today to rage through the debates that exist, but just to highlight, LCA is often cited as one of the challenges to, in particular, chemical recycling. Is it favourable over virgin? Is it not? Is it chemical versus mechanical? Certainly, my view, it's not. We should be looking at all options. We should be technology agnostic because all should be part of the solutions to improving circularity. But LCA is very important because people want to understand the impact of the technologies they adopt and the materials that they use. So I think as soon as the industry can come up with some standard methodology on this, because that's lacking, and in a truly independent LCA, I think the quicker that transparency can happen, then that will help the adoption and development of this at a faster pace. Interestingly, a recent study by the Commission in Europe actually did an assessment and conducted an assessment against other disposal routes. So we actually found chemical recycling much more favourable over incineration, as an example. And that's gained a lot of interest because this was a truly independent study. But I have yet to read the details, so we will see. But it suggests it's a favourable statement. And I think one of the other issues around chemical recycling, there's lots of discussion, debate, as I say, but I think for me one of the points is, again, sitting in Europe is, how does chemical recycling fit into the circular economy? So this brings questions about closed loop and open loop. Clearly, we have both models operating and quite valid to be so. Because not everything is potentially able to follow a closed loop system. Some has to follow an open loop system. Given where we are today in the collection, the technology, and the end market adoption, these models work. For chemical, there is many more, particularly when we start looking at the pyrolysis or anything that's taking things not plastics to plastics, essentially in a direct way. There is the debate as to whether is that truly circular, but I think even closed or wide loops maybe is another phrase to use. It still has the potential to contribute to that. But these are common discussion points around which is the better technology. And as I say, I'm not sure better is necessary. I think is viable is really the answer, because we should be technology agnostic. Looking at some very significant factors, I think ultimately feedstocks is the number one issue for the recycling chain, wherever you sit, mechanical or chemical. Essentially, collection and sorting can be the bottleneck to the sector. We're either not collecting enough or the right quality or grades. in order to meet those end markets. So it doesn't really matter how mature the systems are, because we see it in Europe, and we see it anywhere in the world where the industry cannot get hold of enough material, recycled material, because the collection and sorting is not developing at the same pace almost for the demand that has developed from the end markets. And this is creating that imbalance ultimately. So what's needed? Investments very much in the collection sorting area, and that recycling infrastructure. Of course, as I mentioned, where does the responsibility ultimately lie? It's typically with government. We know in different parts of the world, the Africas, the Asias, the LATAM areas, that there is much more informal sector here, but that doesn't dismiss that sector as very relevant, very key to the contribution to be made on collection and sorting. But how do you invest in that more? How can you develop that more to deliver higher volumes and qualities of material? And of course, with governments trying to marry all of these things up, they're also looking at high levels of investment that are needed. We've just come out of a pandemic. We now have recession affecting different markets, inflationary pressures, cost of living crisis in different areas. We've even got a war in Europe. I mean, there are a lot of factors here that are, naturally distracting governments from perhaps investing in waste management as a priority, understandably, but doesn't dismiss the fact that that's actually what is needed here. And so this does mean there's quite an onus on the recycle supply chain itself to manage better the streams that are coming through. Something to note is, because there's, again, a lot of comment about, are chemical recyclers going to be competing for the same feedstocks as mechanical recyclers? I'm not going to say that there's not going to be overlap at times. It's going to really very much depend on the market dynamics or market conditions at that time. But, here in Europe, we launched a mixed plastics waste pricing report to really price the feedstocks going into chemical recycling, because the market's not mature enough to price the outputs. So we're looking at the inputs, and it's very much come clear how chemical recyclers are really looking to establish their own streams of waste. They don't want to be in competition. They really want to establish their own materials. At times when there's availability, they'll come into the mechanical market for sure, but actually they're looking to develop their own. And this is just a view of some pricing that we have in Europe. But what's interesting in this is that some of the values that have been, some of the materials that have been valued at negative values are starting to shift up as well. So there is a lot of demand for the materials chemical recyclers are really pursuing at this point in time, and it's a really really important development. But generally, you get mono sorted waste really very much focused on mechanical, but then they're much more mixed going into the chemical. But reject bales from RDF. For MRFs are very typically the sort that, as examples of what chemical recyclers are looking for at the moment. But feedstocks is the big question. And so, of course, there's got to be a lot of review, of assessment of, where are we now? Where do we need to be? Is everything working? I mean, there are alternatives being suggested out there, and how we actually challenge waste management. This example here from Plastics Europe, a study that was done, was, ultimately you could go mixed or separate. You could get similar outputs in overall volumes, but actually the composition of that in terms of what's suitable for recycling and versus energy recovery, as seen here in landfill, can be very different. So, do we actually need to challenge the status quo on what we're doing? But of course, that means big change, and change on this scale can be quite challenging. The complex integrated recycling centres, is this the silver bullet? I don't believe in silver bullets. I don't think there is one thing that will be the answer to everything, but I think it's just another option that needs to be considered. But that this is where, collaboration in the chain is really important, to understand what's working, what isn't, and what best practices are that can be applied and really developed to enhance that overall supply. Of course, the Global Plastics Waste Treaty, initiated by the UN, is all eyes are on this. Very high expectations of what this is going to deliver. Is it going to be a game changer? We have to wait and see. Of course, 2024 will be the first kind of insights into what that's shaping up to be. But the real hope that this will instigate some real changes. I think the fact that this has the informal sector at the table is a great step forward, because that's really very important for markets like Africa, like Asia, that are very reliant on that sector as well. But of course, we are in unprecedented times when we look at what's going on and the driver to that. At the moment, we've got a bit of a hiatus in the recycling sector, I think it's fair to say, in terms of, what's happening to production costs. I know this is very relevant to Europe because with a war on our doorstep, that's really driven up production costs. But it's actually, the poor macroeconomic outlook as well. That's global, different extremes, of course, in different markets, but that's got huge inflationary pressure in the market. It's creating a cost of living crisis for many. It's rising up the wage levels as well as people look to improve their income. So when you've got rising costs at a time where this equally equals to weakened demand, really demand is very soft at the moment for products and packaging, and therefore the recycle component of those. We're in a bit of a sticky situation, is probably the kindest way to put it at the moment, in terms of these factors are really competing with each other. So it's a very challenging time at the moment. Excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry. So this is creating a little bit of a, as I say, hiatus for this year. 2023 is a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to play out and how quickly demand can recover. But it's certainly weakened demand for recycled polymers as we see it at the moment. So, covered lots of different aspects here, because it's very important to understand that, when we talk about a circular economy, have that image of that circle in your mind, of course, because that's the model we want to be thinking about. But all the players that are in that, so from waste management through to recyclers, through to converters, to end markets, to retailers, through, everybody needs to be moving in the same direction, which is why collaboration is key. And why this, is really, it's no one party is going to solve this. No one party is going to achieve, the perfect results. Collaboration is key, that everybody's moving in the same direction and utilizing each other's experience and skills and resources to actually come up with the solutions, many of which we haven't really even come up with yet, because there are so many challenges to tackle in terms of finding the solutions for those different aspects. But feedstock needs to be addressed, and that's critical. Of course, at the moment we're looking at virgin prices being much lower from certain parts of the world, which is creating a dilemma for recycle, which in some parts again can be a premium to virgin, and that's testing some of the end market's ability to willingness to pay. Excuse me. But of course, I think a really important point is to think about substitution as well, because we often talk about the substitution between plastics and other materials. But I think there's even competition now or not competition, but potential to substitute in between polymers in the race to be the most sustainable polymer in the market and have those truly circular solutions that can drive the adoption of some materials over others, some polymers over others. But equally heartened to see that there's a lot of innovations coming from this as well. It's not necessarily that we have to tackle the big questions in totality, and that some individual solutions and challenges can be tackled along the way, and I think that's a really important aspect as well as you move forward. So lots of factors to think about, but I think the sentiment, the appetite for the adoption of more sustainable and circular solutions is there. Even given the blip that maybe this year in terms of weaker demand, it's not gone away. Nobody's stepping away from the use of recycled content, and it's only going to build moving forward. It's really for the chain now to working with the partners to actually deliver that feedstock into the chain in terms of the volume and the quality, and finding those technical solutions that can only improve that on both fronts, and then move that through the chain and develop even more streams of plastics waste that can ultimately fill a solution or provide a solution, should I say, to the different end markets that are looking for those. Lots of things to think about, lots of things to tackle, but I think there is only increasing awareness going on now through the chain as well as with consumers to hopefully participate and support that recycling activity. The slides you will get, and there is many of us in the team now that if you want to reach out, myself and my colleagues Igor and Carol actually do cover EMEA, so we have data all around the African markets as well. So do get in touch if you have anything you want to ask us. But I will be joining the panel later on for a Q&A, but I will leave it there for now, and thank you all very much for your attention.